Tomorrow morning, in a room you have never seen, someone wakes up. They have your memories, the real texture of them, the smell of the kitchen you grew up in, the argument you still replay, the password you have never written down. They are certain they are you. They would pass any test you designed because every answer they give is the answer you would give. At the same moment, in your own bed, so do you. Two people, one life, both sincere. Nothing either of you could measure would settle which is the original. The evidence is identical on both sides. Most mornings you do not work out who you are. You arrive already knowing. This film asks what that knowledge is made of. 10 answers from soul and body toward memory, story, and machinery. The last one does not argue about what the self contains. It asks whether the thing asking was ever one thing at all. A warning about the map before you start reading it. Self is not one problem. It is at least 4. The bare sense that experience is happening here to this body. The question of what makes tomorrow's person the same as today's. The remembered story that ties a life together. And the identity other people keep alive in your name. 10 views are coming. Formulation, philosophy, phenomenology, contemplative traditions. They do not share methods. They do not share evidence. Some are laboratory programs. Some are arguments no experiment could settle. A few are not competing at all. They answer different questions and only look like rivals. Each gets judged the same way. What it explains, what supports it, where it breaks. There is a moment in every general anesthetic that nobody remembers. It is the moment remembering stops. The count reaches 7. Then, a ceiling, a different room, a nurse saying your name. Between those 2 points, hours passed. Your body was opened and closed again, and for you, there was nothing. Not darkness, not waiting, not even the sense of time skipped. Experience resumed, and it resumed as yours, with no confusion about whose it was. Something came back, or something never left and was only unreachable. Those are very different claims. The oldest answer in this film insists on the second. Beneath everything that changes about you, there is something that does not. Not your body, which replaces its material. Not your thoughts, which arrive and leave. Not your memories, which fade and rearrange. Something simpler. A subject that has thoughts rather than being made of them. It is the thing all of that is happening to, and it is the same thing now that it was when you were 5. Descartes gave this its sharpest form in the 17th century. Everything about the physical world could be doubted, he argued, including whether he had a body. The doubting itself could not be. There was a thinker. And a thinker, he concluded, is a different kind of thing from a body. Unextended, indivisible, not assembled from parts. That last word carries the weight. Bodies have parts, so bodies can be divided, damaged, replaced piece by piece. A thing with no parts cannot be half present. So the self cannot fade. It cannot be split. It cannot be copied, because there is no arrangement of components for a machine to reproduce. Where is it? Nowhere, strictly, not in space at all. It receives through the brain and acts through it. Brain damage changes what the subject can see, recall, and do. It never touches the subject itself. Modern versions do not always require a soul. Philosophers sometimes call this the simple view, or the further fact view, and its commitment is thinner and harder to dislodge than Descartes. It says only this: whether some future person is you is a further fact. Over and above every fact about bodies, brains, memories, and continuity, assemble the complete description of tomorrow's person. Every cell, every belief, every remembered afternoon. One question can still be open. Will it be me? On this view, that question always has an answer, even where nothing observable could ever tell you what the answer is. It is easy to file this under pre-scientific. It is harder to explain why it will not die. You have never had half a point of view. Your visual field can shrink. Your attention can fragment. Your memory can fail. But the perspective from which those failures are noticed does not arrive in fractions. It is one, or it is absent. Collections do not behave like that. Now the harder gap. Imagine a total account of a human being. Every neuron, every connection, every psychological state those connections support. Read the whole document. Nothing in it says, "This one is mine." Experience is happening from one place to one body. That looks like an extra fact. It is exactly the fact this view was built to name. The intuition sharpens under pressure. Present people with the case from the opening. Two individuals, identical claims, no evidence either way. Most do not conclude the question is malformed. They conclude that one really is the original, and we cannot tell which. That is the further fact view speaking out loud. It may be wrong. It is not confused. So test what the unchanging subject is actually preserving. An illness or an injury alters your temperament. You become impatient or you were tolerant. Careless with people you would once have protected. Indifferent to promises you used to treat as binding. Your memories are intact. Your name is intact. The people who love you say, quietly and without reaching for metaphor, that you are not the same person. They're describing something measurable. In work with families caring for patients with neurodegenerative disease, what predicted whether relatives felt the patient had become someone else was not memory loss. It was change in moral character, honesty, empathy, the capacity to care about the right things. Amnesia, by itself, barely moved that judgment. Now put the question to the substance view. Through all of it, the inner subject was unchanged. So what did it keep? Not your values, not your conduct toward the people closest to you, not the qualities by which they recognized you. Something remained, and nobody can say what. That is the objection, and it is not a technical one. Every feature we would have credited to the enduring subject depends on the physical brain. Alter the chemistry, mood, motivation, and the sense of what matters change with it. Interrupt the electrical activity, and the subject reports nothing whatsoever. The list of jobs the soul was supposed to do keeps shortening, and each vacated job is taken over by something measurable. Defenders have a reply, and it is a decent one. Instruments break, performers do not. A pianist with damaged hands plays badly without becoming a different musician. Brain injury might likewise obstruct the subject's expression while leaving the subject untouched. The trouble is that the analogy describes the wrong kind of failure. When a pianist's hands are damaged, the pianist still wants the piece played properly and is tormented by the result. In the cases that matter here, it is the wanting that changes. They stop finding kindness important, and they are not distressed by the difference. That is the musician's taste being rewritten by the instrument, at which point the enduring subject remains logically possible and idle. It survives every observation because it predicts none. The stakes are not academic. If there is a simple, indivisible subject, death is a change of circumstance rather than an ending. The dread attached to it is a mistake about what kind of thing you are. Dementia becomes something worse than erasure. It becomes confinement, an intact subject sealed inside failing machinery, fully present through every hour that relatives describe as absence. Duplication becomes impossible, and so does uploading. However exact the copy, it is a very convincing stranger. an heir who inherits everything except the fact of being you. Each consequence follows cleanly. Not one of them can be checked. There is a case this view has never handled comfortably, and it is not exotic. Before you had a single memory, or any point of view at all, there was a human organism with your body and your history. Most people say, without hesitation, that it was them. If that is right, identity may not float above the animal. It may be the animal. Somewhere there's a photograph, or there could have been one, taken before you existed as anyone. A human organism, months old, carrying your genome and no opinions, no memories, no name that meant anything yet, no point of view worth the phrase. Every psychological theory in this film says the same thing about it. That was not yet you. You began later, once the mental furniture arrived. Ask almost anyone outside a philosophy department, and the answer comes back without hesitation. Of course that was me. That is where I started. One of those two responses has to be wrong. Animalism takes the second answer seriously and follows it wherever it leads. You are not a soul and not a bundle of memories. You are a living human animal, one organism of the species Homo sapiens, no more and no less. Person is not what you fundamentally are. It is a stage you pass through, the way teenager is a stage, and you can enter it and leave it without ceasing to exist. The question this answers is strict numerical identity. What makes tomorrow's individual the very same individual as today's? So what keeps an organism the same organism? Not its matter. Almost none of the material in your body was there 20 years ago. Cells are replaced. Molecules cycle through and out. Animalism is not the claim that you are a particular quantity of stuff. What persists is an activity. A living organism is a self-maintaining system. It takes in energy. It repairs itself. It regulates its own chemistry. It holds itself away from equilibrium for as long as it can. That activity has been running without interruption, in your case, since some point before you were born. It continued through every night you were unconscious, every anesthetic, every fever that emptied your mind. Interrupt it, and the organism ends. Sustain it, and the organism continues, whatever becomes of the mind it happens to support. The persistence conditions, in other words, are biological rather than psychological. To decide whether the patient in the bed is the same individual admitted 3 weeks ago, you do not test their memory. You establish whether one life has been going on continuously. That has a tidy consequence. Take the oldest puzzle about identity. The ship whose planks are replaced one at a time, until none of the originals remain. It barely troubles a living thing. Organisms are built to replace their parts. The continuity was never in the planks. It was in the sailing. The argument that made animalism respectable again is disarmingly plain. There is a human animal sitting where you are sitting. That is not in dispute. Biology is not optional. That animal has a working brain, and it is doing what thinking things do, following the sentence you are hearing right now. So the animal is thinking. But you are the thinker in that chair. If you are not the animal, then there are two thinkers there having identical thoughts, and one of them is wrongly convinced it is the person. Worse, you would have no way of telling which one you are. Most people, pressed on that, conclude there is one thinker, and it is the animal. Animalism also absorbs the cases that embarrass psychological theories. The fetus, which was you before it was anyone. The patient in a persistent vegetative state whose family is not sitting beside a stranger. Deep, dreamless sleep where psychological continuity is absent and nobody seriously suggests you briefly stopped existing. And it matches how every institution that deals in human beings counts them. Medicine tracks one organism from birth to death. Law tracks one individual. So does every biology textbook. Animalism is not an eccentric proposal. It is the assumption the rest of our knowledge already runs on, finally said out loud. Now take the organ out. Your cerebrum is removed intact and placed in another living body. The tissue supporting your memories, your habits of attention, your particular way of being irritated by particular things. That body wakes. It has your memories. It answers to your name and means it. It grieves the people you would grieve. Behind, in the theater, the original organism is still alive. Heart beating, lungs working, no thoughts. Animalism gives an unambiguous answer, and most people flinch at it. You are the one on the table. The organism is you, and an organ has been removed from you and installed elsewhere. The person leaving the hospital with your inner life is a different animal that has inherited it. Say that plainly. On this view, everything you would call yourself from the inside can be transferred to someone else, and you will not have gone anywhere. Animalists know this is the whole battle. The intuition that you travel with the brain is not a fringe reaction. It is close to universal, and it does not weaken when people think about it longer. A theory that has to overrule it needs a very good reason. Animalists offer one. Intuitions about invented surgery are not evidence about what we are. They are evidence about what we care about, and those are different questions. What you care about, imagining the transplant, is that someone will carry your projects forward, remember your life, and love the people you love. All of that is true of the recipient. None of it requires that the recipient be you. It is a serious reply, and it does real work. But notice the price. It does not restore the intuition, it reclassifies it. It tells you the thing you were most afraid of losing was never identity at all. You have been misdescribing your own deepest concern about death. That may be correct. It is not a small bill. The next view refuses to pay it. If you are the animal, several familiar hopes go quiet. Preserving a brain or a head preserves an organ. There is nobody inside it waiting. Uploading is not a transfer and could never be one. At best, it produces a very well-informed successor to you. Brain death and your death come apart. That matters enormously in intensive care. A body maintained after the brain has ceased is still the same organism it always was, and the family in the corridor is not simply being sentimental. And the beginning of your existence moves back to a point long before your first memory. The consequences reach directly into some of the most contested questions in medical ethics. Still, the transplant case will not stay buried. Almost everyone who imagines it feels that the person walks out and the body stays behind. If that feeling is tracking something real, the animal was never the unit that mattered. The organ was. An identity might follow the brain wherever it goes, including into places no organism could survive. In 2019, a research team published brain scans from 6 adults who were each missing one cerebral hemisphere. Not damaged, missing. Removed in childhood to stop catastrophic epilepsy, in some cases, almost entirely. Half a cortex, gone for decades. They held jobs. They spoke fluently. Their large-scale brain networks, measured at rest, looked strikingly similar to those of people with 2 hemispheres. Whatever had been lost, one thing had not. There was still one person there. Nobody believed a second person had died on the operating table, least of all them. Half the organ can go, and the individual continues. So how much of it was ever load-bearing? You go where your brain goes, not the whole body, not the whole organism. Personal identity follows the continued functioning of the brain, or, in the more careful versions, of whichever parts of it sustain consciousness and psychology. The brain is the physical thing whose ongoing operation constitutes your continued existence. Move it, and you have moved. This mechanism is easier to state than to defend. Its defenders know it. What persists is not a quantity of tissue. Neurons are living cells. Their proteins turn over, their connections strengthen and prune. Their chemistry is continuously remade. If identity required the same physical material, you would have failed the test long ago. What persists is the organization, held continuously in one physical system. Your brain right now stands in a very specific relation to your brain 1 second ago. The structure that exists now was produced by the structure that existed then, gradually, without a break. That unbroken thread is what these views identify with you. The move does two things at once. It permits enormous change. Learn a language. Lose a decade of memories. Become a substantially different person. All of it is allowed, provided the change happens to the same continuously maintained system. And it forbids one specific thing: copying. A perfect duplicate assembled from a scan has the organization, but not the thread. It is causally connected to a document, not to you. Which parts count? Most versions point to the cerebrum, or to whatever supports experience and psychology. The brainstem keeps the organism running, but is not obviously where anyone is. So a person can lose a hemisphere and continue. Lose the whole cerebrum, and they end, even if the body carries on breathing. What emerges is a middle position, more permissive than animalism because the body is negotiable, more restrictive than the psychological views ahead because the wiring is not. No single experiment supports this view. What supports it is the accumulated weight of everything clinical neuroscience has found for a century and a half. Every capacity you would list as part of yourself has a neural dependency that can be mapped. Damage particular structures in the medial temporal lobe, and the ability to lay down new memories goes with them. Leave the tissue intact but suppress its activity, and there is nobody there to ask. Nothing else in the body behaves like this. Transplant a heart, a liver, a kidney, and no one wonders who woke up. Transplant a face, and the recipient is unquestionably still themselves. There is exactly one organ whose replacement would make the question urgent, and everybody already knows which one. The law has quietly agreed. In most jurisdictions, the criterion of death is no longer the stopping of the heart. A heart can be restarted or bypassed. The criterion is the irreversible loss of brain function. We have already written brain continuity into the rules that govern when a person ceases to exist. And it explains the intuition that broke animalism. Your cerebrum is carried across the theater. It seems obvious you went with it, because the thing physically constituting you was carried across the theater. The intuition is not sentimental confusion. Animalism simply drew the boundary of the individual in the wrong place. Here is the operation that decides it. One neuron in your cortex is swapped for an artificial unit that does exactly what that neuron did. Same inputs, same outputs, same timing. You notice nothing, because every other cell receives precisely the signals it received before. Do it again tomorrow, and the day after. Continue for years, one cell at a time, until no biological neuron remains and the whole pattern is running on a different substrate. Where did you stop? There is no plausible answer. Not at the first unit, not at the last, since by then a single cell was all that stood between a person and nobody. Not at some point in the middle, because that would mean one silicon component is the difference between an individual and an unusually convincing imitation. And you cannot say you faded, because at every stage the system reports full, ordinary experience, generated by the same continuously maintained organization as before. So either you survived a complete change of material, in which case the material was never what constituted you, or you ended at some point that neither you nor anyone else could detect. Take the first horn, that you survived because organization was what mattered. That is the honest answer, and it dismantles the view from the inside. Because organization can be instantiated twice. Divide the two hemispheres and give each its own body, a proposal that the hemispherectomy findings make considerably less absurd than it once sounded. Both resulting people have a continuous physical connection to the original brain. Both carry the organization. Brain continuity says each of them is you. But you cannot be two people. The standard repair is a no-branching clause. You survive as the continuer of your brain, provided there is exactly one. Add a second, and neither qualifies. Look at what that clause does. Whether you survive tomorrow's operation now depends on a second operation somewhere else. Another building, another country. Performed by people you will never meet, with no causal contact with your brain at all. Your existence becomes hostage to a stranger's schedule. The clause rescues the letter of the theory. It does so by making your survival depend on something that has nothing to do with you. Brain continuity brings some ordinary practices into focus and complicates several hopes. Brain death is your death, without remainder, and the body that continues afterwards is a body rather than a person in difficulty. Preserving your brain and later restarting it would be survival in the strict sense. The thread would be unbroken. Scanning you and rebuilding you would not be, however faithful, the reconstruction. The individual who woke would remember everything and would be somebody else. And gradual replacement, a prosthetic hippocampus, then a prosthetic cortex, becomes the only route to a new substrate that counts as you arriving there, which puts a strange and specific premium on doing it slowly. Hold on to what the replacement case forced, though. If a brain built from entirely different material can still be you, the matter was never the point. The pattern was. And a pattern is not the kind of thing that has to be made of anything in particular. Perhaps identity was never physical at all. Perhaps what carries you is the connected shape of a mind. A British musician and broadcaster contracted a viral infection of the brain in 1985. It destroyed the structures that lay down new memories. Since then, he has lived inside a window a few seconds wide. He keeps a notebook. In it, he writes, again and again, that he has this moment woken for the first time. Each entry crosses out the last one. That one must have been written by someone who was not really conscious. And yet, put a score in front of him and he conducts. Sit him at a piano and he plays, accurately, music he cannot remember learning. When his wife comes into the room, he greets her with enormous joy every time, as though after years apart. The connected shape of his mind has been shattered in one place and left perfectly intact in others. So which of those threads was carrying him? Locke put the question into its modern form at the end of the 17th century and gave an answer that has organized the argument ever since. What makes you the same person over time is neither the same soul nor the same body. It is the same consciousness, extended backwards. As far as your awareness can reach into a past action and own it, that action was yours. The contemporary version is broader. Identity consists in overlapping chains of psychological connection. Memories, intentions, beliefs, desires, character traits. Each link produced in the right way by the one before it. The first version of this had a fatal flaw, and Thomas Reid found it within a century. Take a boy flogged for stealing fruit from an orchard. He grows into a young officer who, on the day of his first battle, remembers the flogging. That officer becomes an elderly general who remembers the battle vividly and has lost the orchard completely. By Locke's rule, the officer is the boy and the general is the officer, but the general is not the boy. Identity has been made to fail the one thing identity cannot fail. The repair splits one idea into two. Connectedness is the direct relation. Today's you remembers last week, intends what tomorrow's you will carry out, holds beliefs formed last year. That relation weakens across decades and can disappear entirely across a long life. Continuity is the chain of overlapping connections. The chain constitutes the person. No single link does. The right image is not a wire running from birth to death. It is a rope. No fiber runs the whole length. The rope holds because the fibers overlap. Two further requirements do a great deal of work. First, the relation is not only backward-looking. It includes intentions and plans in progress. The mind reaches forward as well as back. Second, the connections must be produced in the right way. If a stranger were somehow given a vivid impression of your childhood, that would not make them you. Your experience has to be causing the later state. What persists then is neither stuff nor a subject. It is a pattern of dependence, one mental state leaning on the last, all the way down. This view earns its dominance by explaining what almost everyone already believes. Ask why the individual leaving the theater with your cerebrum is you, and nobody answers that the tissue moved. They answer that it remembers your life and intends your plans. Psychological continuity does not have to argue for the transplant intuition. It simply names what that intuition was tracking, and it does so without needing the organ at all. It also fits what the brain appears to be built for. The network that reconstructs your past largely builds your future, too. Imagining tomorrow's difficult conversation recruits much of the machinery that recalls yesterday's. Patients with severe damage to those structures are often impaired at remembering episodes. They are also impaired at imagining new ones. This is not a philosopher's abstraction. It looks like a function the nervous system performs, holding a life together in both directions from the present moment. The view also matches how responsibility is assigned. We treat promises as binding because the person who made one is continuous with the person who must keep it. Contract, punishment, forgiveness, marriage, all of it presupposes a chain of roughly the kind this theory describes. And return to the musician. His episodic chain is broken almost completely. His skills persist. His musical knowledge persists. His attachment to his wife persists, undiminished, across decades he cannot recall. Psychological continuity was never only about remembering events. Several threads run through a life, and this is the theory that takes their plurality seriously. Now split the chain. Your two hemispheres are separated, and each is placed in a body. Both people wake. Both have your memories, your temperament, your commitments, your accent, your grudges. Neither is a copy in any sense that matters. Both are physically and psychologically continuous with you, equally, by exactly the same root. Which one is you? Not both. Identity cannot branch. Not neither, since each has everything the theory says a person consists of, and either would plainly have been you had the other operation been cancelled. And not one rather than the other, because there is nothing whatever to choose between them. Parfit's response is the most consequential move in this literature, and it is not a repair. He accepts the argument and turns it around. If the theory cannot say which one is you, perhaps that was never the important question. What you actually care about when you care about surviving is present twice over. That someone wakes up carrying your memories, finishes your work, keeps your promises. Identity fails. Everything you wanted from identity succeeds. On this view, you should regard fission as roughly as good as an ordinary night's sleep. The deeper problem is not exotic at all, and it requires no surgery. The chain is made of psychological states, and psychological states are not stored records. Retrieving a memory is not opening a file. It is rebuilding an episode from fragments, guided by what you currently expect and believe. Animal research on reconsolidation pointed to something stronger still. A reactivated memory can become temporarily unstable and require fresh protein synthesis to persist. Remembering can alter the thing remembered. In humans, controlled studies have implanted whole autobiographical events that never happened. A childhood mishap, a lost afternoon, in a meaningful proportion of participants. Researchers still argue sharply over how to separate a genuine false memory from mere acceptance of a suggestion. The headline figures move considerably with the scoring rules. The direction of the evidence is not in dispute even where the numbers are. The chain is partly edited, and it is edited in the direction of whoever you currently take yourself to be. Defenders reply that the theory never demanded accuracy. What it demands is appropriate causal dependence. Today's state must be produced in the right way by yesterday's. A distorted memory still descends from the experience. The rope holds even where fibers have frayed. That reply works. But look at what it concedes. The thing carrying you through time is not a record of your life. It is a document that every reader has revised, including the most interested reader of all. So what exactly has been continuous? The life or the editing? Take this seriously, and several things move. Advanced directives acquire real authority. The person who wrote yours is continuous with the patient the doctors will face, and their instructions are not a stranger's opinion about someone else's body. Dementia becomes something more troubling than an illness. As connectedness thins, the theory says the individual in the bed is only distantly related to the person who lived that life, which is uncomfortably close to what exhausted families already say quietly, and then feel ashamed of saying. Uploading becomes possible in principle, provided the causal chain runs the right way, and your obligations to your distant future self start to look less like prudence and more like a duty owed to someone else, which may be exactly the right description of what you owe a 70-year-old you would barely recognize. Then there is the thing you have been carrying since the objection. If your memories are partly reconstructed, and reconstructed in the service of the person you take yourself to be, the chain is not the foundation. It is the output. Something else has been holding those fragments together and giving them a shape. Whatever it is, it does not need them to be true. 4 answers. 4 amputations. The substance view kept the subject and lost any way of finding it. Animalism kept the organism and had to overrule the transplant intuition almost everyone shares. Brain continuity kept the physical thread and could not survive being copied. Psychological continuity kept what you actually care about, then admitted its material is partly written after the fact. Each of them saved one candidate by sacrificing something another one called essential. None of them paid less than the others. They also share an assumption. Each treats the self as a thing that endures, a subject, a body, an organ, a chain. Then asks what could keep such a thing intact. The next views drop it. They start somewhere colder. The self is not preserved at all. It is produced, continuously, and only for as long as the building goes on. 2 siblings describe the same afternoon from childhood. The house, the weather, who said what, who was crying by the end. The accounts are detailed, confident, and irreconcilable. Neither is lying. Both have done exactly what remembering does, assembled a coherent episode out of fragments, filled the gaps in whatever way made sense given everything they have since become. Each account is doing a job in the life of the person telling it. That is the something holding the fragments together without needing them to be true. Not a record, a shape imposed on the record, continuously, by the one keeping it. This chapter's answer is that the shape is not a distortion of the self. It is the self. You are not a thing concealed behind your experiences. You are the account that organizes them, not a story in the sense of a fiction, A story in the sense of an ongoing interpretation. A selection of events arranged causally, given a direction, with a protagonist whose values are supposed to explain what happened. A life becomes one life for a reason that has nothing to do with persistence. It is held together as a single narrative, continuously, by the person living it and by the people around them. How does an interpretation do work that a soul or a chain was supposed to do? A narrative does 4 things. Out of the enormous number of things that have happened to you, it selects a very small set. It links them causally. This is why I left. That is why I never trusted them again. It gives the sequence a direction, so it reads as development rather than a list. And it carries a verdict. This was a defeat. That was the beginning of something. Psychologists working on life stories keep finding the same structures. Some accounts move repeatedly from suffering toward gain, redeeming bad episodes by what they made possible. Others run the opposite way. Good episodes spoiled by what came after. Which pattern dominates? A person's telling tracks how that person is doing. Narrative identity is usually placed as one layer among several. Underneath sit dispositional traits, the broad tendencies visible from outside. In the middle sit goals and strategies that shift with circumstance. The story sits on top, and it is the only layer that answers who, specifically, this is. 2 constraints keep the view from collapsing into fantasy. The story has to be articulable. You must be able to give some account of yourself when it matters, even if you almost never do. And it has to answer to reality. A narrative built on events that demonstrably did not occur has failed. Between those constraints, there is room. The same childhood supports many honest tellings. Which one you hold is not a small matter, because on this view, it is not a description of you. It is the operation that makes you one person, rather than a sequence of episodes. Here is what the first 4 views handled badly. You have changed enormously. Your beliefs, your body, your tastes, most of yourselves, a fair amount of your character. None of it is what it was at 15. Yet the phrase, "when I was 15," is not a metaphor. Narrative explains that at once. Continuity is not the preservation of contents. It is the ongoing work of gathering contents into one account. It also explains what breaks identity in practice. Recall that families judging whether a patient has become someone else are moved most by changes in moral character, not by memory loss. That is precisely what this theory predicts. A story is about a protagonist with values. Remove the values and the story cannot continue, however many facts survive. There is clinical weight behind it too. Much of what effective psychotherapy does is not the recovery of buried facts. It is the construction of a different account of the same events, one in which the person is not merely what happened to them. When that works, it does not change the past. It changes whose past it is. The literature needs calibration. Most of it is self-report, much of it correlational. It samples historically from a narrow slice of the world. It establishes that people build these structures and that the differences track well-being. It does not establish that the story constitutes the person. Try it on your own foundation stone. Choose the memory you would name if someone asked what made you who you are. The moment you were let down, or trusted, or saw clearly what kind of person you were going to be. Most people have one. It is usually early, usually vivid, and usually load-bearing. Now suppose you were shown, beyond argument, that it never happened. Not distorted, absent. Records, witnesses, a date that makes it impossible. The reality constraint says the story was wrong. But here is the more interesting half of what this theory says. The decades of decisions you made under that story were not wrong. The caution, the loyalty, the career, the particular way you are with your own children. All of that happened. All of it was organized by an event that did not. Does the person built on a false foundation become less real? On this view, no. The foundation was never the load-bearing element. The building was. The sharpest objection comes from someone who reports that he simply does not work this way. Galen Strawson argues that the narrative picture is false as a universal truth about human beings. As an ethical recommendation, he says, it is worse than false. Some people do experience life as a continuous, unfolding story. Others, whom he calls episodics, do not. They have a past and can recall it, but feel little sense that the person in those memories is them in any deep way. The present is where they live. On his account, this is not a deficit. If that is right, narrative identity has mistaken one temperament for the architecture of selfhood. There is a second version, harder to shake. A story requires a teller. If the narrative constitutes the self, who is narrating? Either there is a self prior to the story, and the story describes rather than creates it, or there is not, and the theory owes us authorship without an author. Narrativists reply that the story need not be conscious, verbal, or experienced as a story at all. It can be implicit in how a person acts, plans, and holds commitments. And they note, with some justice, that Strawson's own case is delivered as an autobiographical account of a life. The reply survives. It survives by shrinking the claim. What began as "you are your story" becomes "your story is one of the things that makes you cohere, more defensible, considerably less dramatic." A self made of story carries consequences that are difficult to look at directly. Dementia becomes an injury to authorship, not to storage. What is lost is not only the facts, it is the capacity to go on gathering them into anything. Courtroom testimony becomes a genuinely difficult object. A sincere witness is reporting a reconstruction and has no way of knowing which parts of it were reconstructed. And there is something more hopeful in it. If the account is doing this much work, then it can be revised, not by inventing a past, but by reading the existing one differently. Within limits that are real, you have some say in who you have been. Because a story needs a narrator with a life long enough to tell it. And there are points of view with no story at all. A newborn, a few hours old. An animal. A person whose language has been taken by a stroke. None of them can narrate, and every one of them is unmistakably somewhere, looking out. That arrives before the telling. It may be what the telling has been about. Before the last views begin removing the ground, it is worth putting your own answer on record while it still feels obvious. What is actually carrying you through time? One word is enough. Body. Brain. Memory. Values. Story. Something else. Nothing. Leave it below, or you will find it again when this ends. The interesting question is not what you answer now, it is whether your answer is still standing in an hour. Put your left hand behind a screen. In front of you, where that hand should be, place a rubber one. Someone strokes both with a brush. The hidden hand you cannot see. The rubber hand you can. Same moment, same place. Within a minute or two, for most people, something shifts. The touch is felt not where the brush actually is, but out there, in the rubber. Raise a hammer over it and people flinch. Nobody in that room believes the rubber hand is theirs. Something below the level of belief has already decided that it is. That is the layer arriving before any story, not an account of who you are. The bare fact that this body is registering as yours. Before biography, before language, before you could have told anyone anything about yourself, there was already a self of a much thinner kind. Philosophers call it the minimal or experiential self. It has almost no content. It consists in two facts. Experience is happening here, in this body, and the movements are being made by this system, not watched from outside. Ownership and agency, with no name attached. This is not a theory of identity through time. It is an account of what it takes to be a point of view at all. The mechanism is integration, and its currency is coincidence. Your nervous system receives several streams that are, in principle, unrelated. What the eyes see, what the skin registers, where the joints report the limbs to be, which way the inner ear says the head is tilted, and a continuous flow of signals from inside the body. That last stream is interoception. It is the one we notice least and depend on most. The body model is the brain's best account of what all those streams have in common. Seen touch and felt touch arrive together, repeatedly in the same place. The simplest explanation is that the seen object is the felt object, so the model updates. Ownership is not a judgment you make, it is a conclusion a body model reaches, and it can reach a wrong one inside 90 seconds of brushwork. Ownership and agency come apart, which is how we know they are separate variables. You can own a limb you cannot move. You can also produce a movement and fail to register it as yours. The action occurs. The body performs it. The sense of having done it never arrives. That makes no sense unless authorship is computed rather than given. Location behaves the same way. The felt position of the perspective, the place experience seems to be issuing from, is not fixed by where the eyes happen to be. It is inferred from the same evidence, and when the evidence conflicts, the inference can put you somewhere else. Notice what this supplies that none of the earlier chapters had: a mechanism for mindness. Not a subject who owns experiences, but a process that continuously tags them as belonging here. The evidence is unusually clean for a question this old, because the effects can be produced on demand. The rubber hand result was published in 1998 and has been reproduced many hundreds of times since. Synchronous stroking produces the illusion. Delay the two touches by a fraction of a second and it collapses. The system is not simply suggestible, it is doing something specific with timing. In 2007, 2 independent groups scaled it to the whole body. In one design, participants wore a head-mounted display. It showed a live feed of their own back, filmed from 2 meters behind. Their real back was stroked in synchrony with the seen one. Their sense of where they were drifted toward the virtual body. Asked afterwards to walk back to their starting position, they misjudged it in the direction the illusion predicted. 5 years earlier, something less controlled but more arresting had been documented. A patient was being assessed for epilepsy surgery. Current applied at the right angular gyrus repeatedly produced the sensation of leaving the body and viewing it from above. Increased the current and the effect intensified. Handle that carefully. It is a single patient, and it is not evidence that anything left the head. It is evidence for the opposite. The experience of being located outside your body can be manufactured by a current applied to a piece of cortex. Then there is the clinical counterpart. In depersonalization, perception stays intact. Colors, sounds, and faces all arrive normally, and the feeling of mindness does not. People describe watching their own hands act and their own voice speak with the sense of ownership subtracted. If mindness can go missing while everything else remains, it was a separate component all along. Sit with what that state would actually mean for you. Everything you use to identify yourself remains. Your memories are accessible. Your name is on your documents. Your body is where it was, obeying you, unmistakably the one you have always had. And the sense that any of it is yours is gone. You would still be able to say accurately that these are your hands. You would say it the way you would say a rented car is your car. Correct, and describing no felt relation whatever. People in this state commonly fear they are losing their minds. They usually are not, but the reasoning is sound. Something that ought to be impossible to lose has gone. So which one was the self? The system that owns the experiences, or the feeling of ownership? In that state, you have exactly one of the two, and nobody who has been there describes themselves as intact. Nobody serious attacks the evidence here. The complaint is that this theory is answering a different question from the one the film opened with. Everything described here operates on a timescale of seconds, recomputed moment by moment. That explains, beautifully, why experience feels as though it is happening to someone. It says nothing about tomorrow. Nothing about why the someone it happens to, then, is you, rather than a numerically different point of view running on the same equipment. A minimal self is generated fresh each morning. Two of them, separated by a night of dreamless sleep, stand in no relation this account can describe. Pressed hard, the theory cannot say that a life contains one point of view rather than 30,000 consecutive ones. There is a second version of the complaint. Perhaps ownership and agency are not the self, but the conditions under which anything could be a self. The frame rather than the picture. A camera has a position and a field of view. That does not make it a photographer. Defenders reply, correctly as far as it goes, that the minimal self was never offered as an answer to the persistence question. It answers the experiential question, and treating the two as rivals is the actual confusion. That settles the dispute and opens a larger one. If this view and the previous four answer different questions, the map is not a list of competitors at all, and nobody has yet said what it is instead. Ground the felt self in the body, and several things change shape. Your prostheses and your avatars stop being tools. A limb the body model has absorbed is part of you, at the level where ownership is settled. That has real consequences for how such devices are designed, and for how their failure is handled. Disorders of body ownership stop being disorders of belief. Someone who cannot feel a limb as theirs is not making a reasoning error. The computation that assigns ownership has failed, and arguing with them is beside the point. Chronic pain and chronic illness stop being events that happen to a self. They become alterations of it. The interoceptive stream they disturb is part of what constitutes the sense of being anyone. And a mind transferred to a substrate with no body may not simply be a person who lacks a body. It may be missing the thing that made experience feel as though it belonged to anyone. Even so, the body cannot account for everything filed under your name. Your promises are not in your tissue. Neither is your reputation, your citizenship, or your standing with the people who remember what you did in 2011. Erase every person who ever recognized you. Erase every record that your name existed. Leave the body and the memories exactly as they are. Something enormous has gone missing. Some of you may not be inside you. Imagine it precisely. The details are where it bites. You wake tomorrow with your body, your memories, and every skill you have ever acquired. Nothing inside you has changed. But nobody recognizes you. Not your family. They are polite and puzzled. Your name returns no records, no birth certificate, no employer, no debts, no photographs in anyone's phone. The people you wronged do not remember being wronged. The people who owe you do not owe you. You could describe yourself for hours. Not one sentence would be confirmable by anything outside your own head. Ask honestly whether the person who wakes into that world is you, undamaged, or you with something removed. Part of what you are is not located in you. On this view, identity is produced and maintained in the space between people, through language, recognition, roles, obligations, and the plain fact of being known. Not merely influenced by others, partly constituted by them. Some properties that are unquestionably yours have no position inside your skin. The layer at issue is the social self, the person as distinct from the organism and from the point of view. It starts in development, and it runs in one direction only. An infant does not regulate itself. Its distress is managed by somebody else, soothed, named, interpreted. Over years, that external regulation is taken inward. The capacity to calm yourself, hold a plan, talk yourself out of something, begins as something another person did to you and becomes something you do. On this account, the inner voice is not a native faculty. It is an imported one. The same movement builds reflective self-awareness. You come to see yourself as an object at all by seeing yourself through the responses of others. What gets internalized is not only their opinions, but their standpoint, the capacity to regard yourself from outside. Then there is recognition, which is a status rather than a feeling. Being someone's parent, a citizen, a doctor, someone trusted. None of those are facts about your body or your brain. They are conferred. They can be withdrawn. And while they hold, they generate obligations that persist straight through your moods. And other people hold parts of your history you cannot reach. What you were like at 20. What you said that mattered. How you behaved when it counted. Independent records, sometimes more accurate than yours and unreachable without them. The claim is that none of this is an accessory to a self that was already finished. It is load-bearing. Even the standard laboratory marker of self-awareness turns out to be culturally shaped. The classic test places a mark on a young child's face and puts them before a mirror. Touching the mark counts as recognizing the reflection. In North American samples, most children pass by their second birthday. Compare 6 societies and the picture fractures. Pass rates ran from roughly 90% in the United States down to none at all in a Fijian sample, with several sites near half. In a separate Kenyan study of 82 children, 2 touched the mark. The author's interpretation matters, and it is not that those children lacked self-recognition. Most of them froze, a response consistent with a strong norm against undoing something an adult has deliberately done. Even the way a child demonstrates self-awareness is already shaped by what that child's society expects of children. Now consider what you think in. Your inner speech runs in a language you did not invent, using distinctions your culture drew before you arrived. Your most private reflection is conducted in borrowed equipment. And recall the finding from earlier. The judgment that someone has become a different person tracks change in their moral character, and it is made by others, about qualities that only exist in relation to other people. Identity, in the sense that operates inside real families, is a verdict delivered from outside. Follow the erasure to its end and take inventory. What survives? Your body, unchanged, every sensation. Your memories, intact and vivid. Your skills, your tastes, your minimal self, taking over exactly as before. What is gone? Your standing. Every obligation anyone had toward you. Every claim you had on anyone. The word you would use to introduce yourself, which now refers to nothing. Even the possibility of being wronged, since nobody owes you anything that could be violated. You could still say who you are. You could no longer be it, in the sense in which being a father, a debtor, a friend, or a suspect is something a person is. The relational view says a substantial part of you was held in other people and has just been deleted. The rival says you have lost nothing but circumstances. Choosing between those is harder than it looks, and the difficulty is the point. The objection is a single word, constitutive. Nobody denies that other people shape us, The ambitious claim is that they are part of us, that some portion of the self is located outside the person. There is a plain case against it. People survive extreme isolation. Prisoners held alone for years, sailors, hermits. They suffer badly, and they do not report becoming no one. They report being themselves alone. If social relations were constituents, removing them should have removed a part rather than merely making life unbearable. The reply is that the isolated person is not alone. They argue with absent people, hold themselves to imported standards, think in a borrowed language, and narrate to a listener who is not in the room. The scaffolding is inside now, but it was assembled from outside, which is exactly what the theory predicted. That reply is strong. It also quietly changes the claim. It converts a thesis about where the self is currently located into a thesis about how the self was historically built. Whether anyone is still holding a piece of you is a question the reply declines to answer. Once parts of you are held by other people, familiar practices look different. Prolonged solitary confinement stops being deprivation of company. It becomes the withdrawal of the conditions under which a person maintains themselves, which would explain why its effects run so far beyond anything physically done to them. Caring for someone with advanced dementia becomes identity work rather than comfort. Relatives who go on addressing the person they knew are not in denial. They are holding open a role the person can no longer hold alone, and erasing a record, a name, a history, a legal existence, becomes a real injury rather than an administrative inconvenience. It removes something that was genuinely theirs. Recognition cannot be the whole answer, though, because it presupposes what it is meant to explain. Before anyone can recognize you, something has to be there to recognize. One system, continuously generating a perspective, a sense of agency, and a boundary between itself and everything else. Nothing so far has said how biological matter manages that. What follows claims to know, and its answer is that the self is something the brain has to keep guessing. The ground has moved without anyone announcing it. For 4 chapters, the self was something to be preserved. For 3, it has been something to be produced, a story that must keep being told, a body model that must keep being computed, a standing that must keep being granted. On this side of the map, the self is not a possession. It is an achievement, and achievements lapse. But an achievement can still have an author. Every view so far has assumed that somewhere in all this activity there is one thing doing it, or at least one thing it is happening to. The final 3 views take that assumption apart. The first asks what the author is made of. The second asks whether there is only one. The third asks whether there was ever anyone there at all. Try to tickle yourself. You cannot, and the reason is not simply that you know what is coming. When you move your hand, the motor system issues a prediction of what that movement will feel like. The prediction reaches the sensory areas at the same moment as the touch. It cancels most of it. The signal is suppressed because it was expected, and expected because you generated it. Somebody else's hand produces no such prediction. Nothing is canceled. The sensation lands at full strength. So the difference between something you did and something that happened to you is not read off the world. It is computed in advance by a system making guesses about its own effects. Now scale that up. Suppose it is not one trick among many. Suppose it is the whole design. The self you experience is a model, not a thing being modeled, a model. Something a living system generates because controlling a body in an unpredictable world requires a working representation of the body doing the controlling. The sense of owning this hand, of being located behind these eyes, of being the one who decides. Each of those is a variable in an ongoing best guess, maintained because it works rather than because it is true. The self is a special case of perception, so start there. The brain is not a device that receives the world and reads it off. It generates predictions about the causes of its incoming signals, compares them against what arrives, and revises. What you experience is never the input. It is the model's current best explanation of the input. That is why perception fills gaps you never notice, and why it goes wrong in ways that follow rules. Now turn the same machinery inward. The body is the one object always present, always producing signals, always subject to your commands. Controlling it requires a model of it, its configuration, its likely next state, the consequences of its own actions. That model solves three problems at once. Which signals are caused by this body? The ownership problem. Which changes in the world are caused by this body's own actions? The agency problem. And what the body's internal state is and needs to become? The regulation problem. Ownership falls out of the first. When visual, tactile, and proprioceptive evidence agree that a hand is here, the best available explanation is that this hand is mine. The model commits. Feed it contradictory evidence in the right rhythm, and it commits to the rubber one instead. The 1998 illusion is not a glitch. It is the mechanism working exactly as specified on corrupted data. Agency falls out of the second, the tickle case run backwards. A movement the system predicted is tagged as yours. A movement it failed to predict is tagged as the world's. The third is where the theory becomes ambitious. Predicting the body's internal state is not a spectator activity. It is what regulation consists of. The system anticipates what the tissues are about to need and acts before the need arrives. That is why thirst precedes dehydration. Emotion, on this account, is roughly what interoceptive prediction feels like from the inside. One component completes the picture. The model is transparent. You do not experience it as a model, any more than you experience your visual field as a rendering. You see through it. That is why the self feels given rather than manufactured. A model you cannot see is indistinguishable from the inside, from the thing it models. It absorbs the previous chapter without effort. The rubber hand. The shifted body. The sensation of hovering above yourself under electrical stimulation. None of these needs a separate explanation here. They are one thing. A body model resolving conflicting evidence the way a good inference engine should, and being wrong because the evidence was rigged. A theory that predicts results already on the table is doing real work. It also answers a question none of the earlier views asked. Not what the self is made of, why there is one at all. A self-model is a control device. Any system that has to keep a complicated body alive in a changing world has a reason to build one. The self stops being a metaphysical surplus. It becomes biological engineering with a job description. Then there is the clinic. Researchers in this framework have proposed that depersonalization arises when the brain assigns unusually low confidence to signals from inside the body. Interoceptive predictions stop being corrected by interoceptive evidence. The model that normally tags experience as mine loses its grip. Intact perception, absent ownership. Precisely what patients describe. This remains a proposal, not a finding, but it can be tested, which is more than most theories of the self have ever managed. The calibration matters. This is a research program, not a consensus. Its broadest formulations have been criticized for being so general that no result could count against them. Specific applications remain contested. What can be said is that it is the most productive framework we have for turning the self into something a laboratory can address. Instances the model somewhere else. Suppose a system elsewhere runs a self-model with your parameters, your body schema, your history, your predictive habits, your way of anticipating other people. It reports being you. It is not lying and not confused. There is no fact it lacks access to, because on this view, there is no such fact. Ask which one is the real you, and the theory does something the earlier chapters never did. It refuses the question. There is no further ingredient. A self-model that models itself as you is a self-model experiencing itself as you, and there can be two. Not an original and a copy, two instances, each with a complete and equally valid claim. No test in the universe distinguishes them, because the thing that would have to differ does not exist. Every earlier theory treated duplication as a paradox to be resolved. This one treats it as unremarkable, which is either the most reassuring position in the film or the most desolate. Every theory of consciousness eventually walks into the same wall, and here it arrives in a particular shape. Grant everything. Grant that the brain builds a model, that the model represents a boundary, an owner, and an agent, and that the representation is transparent. You have explained why a system would represent itself as a self. You have not explained why there is something it is like to be that representation. A weather model represents a storm without any wind blowing inside the computer. Why is a self-model different? Why does this particular representation come with an interior? And transparency, which does so much work in the theory, is not itself a mechanism. It is a description of a phenomenon, that the model is not experienced as a model, restated as though it were an explanation, which is close to saying the self feels real because it feels real. Defenders reply, with justice, that this is not an objection to the self-model theory in particular. It is the hard problem of consciousness in self-shaped clothing, and it applies with equal force to every physical account of the mind. The theory never promised to explain why there is experience. It promised to explain the structure of self-consciousness given that there is. And by that standard, it is doing well. That reply is fair. It is also a boundary rather than a solution. It concedes that the deepest question about the self has been set aside rather than answered. And a model can explain why experience is organized around a center. It has not yet explained why there appears to be only one. Treat the self as a control device, and some hard things follow. Your sense of being one continuous owner of your life is a piece of equipment. It is not a discovery you made about yourself. It is a parameter, maintained because a body without one would be harder to keep alive. Conditions from depersonalization to certain chronic pain states become model failures rather than feelings about the world. That is not a way of calling them unreal. A miscalibrated instrument still produces real readings. A sufficiently good model of you could be built, and it would not know it was not the original, because there is nothing there to know. And the question you have been asking since the opening minute, which one is really me, is not a hard question with an elusive answer. It is a question with no fact to settle it. Hold the model steady and something odd shows through it. It explains construction well and unity badly. A brain runs enormous numbers of processes at once, competing, disagreeing, reaching different conclusions about the same situation. The model presents the result as one voice, but in a small group of patients, the machinery that produces that appearance was surgically interrupted. What they revealed is still being argued about 60 years later. To control severe epilepsy, surgeons occasionally cut the corpus callosum. It is the great bundle of fibers joining the two hemispheres, on the order of 200 million of them. The operation works. Patients recover, go home, and seem entirely ordinary to their families. Then, researchers put them in front of a screen. Flash a word to the left visual field. That field reports to the right hemisphere. Ask what they saw, and they say nothing. Then ask the left hand, controlled by that same right hemisphere, to point it out among objects. It points correctly. In the most quoted demonstration, one hemisphere was shown a chicken's claw and the other a snow scene. The right hand chose a chicken. The left hand chose a shovel. Asked why, the patient did not hesitate. You need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Something in there had not seen the snow. It explained the shovel anyway, instantly, confidently, and wrongly. What feels like one author may be a result rather than a cause. On this family of views, the brain contains many semi-independent systems that perceive, evaluate, and act in parallel, with no inner office where they file reports. What reaches you as a single decision is the outcome of a competition, and one of the competing systems specializes in producing a coherent account of whatever the others have already done. The layers under examination are experiential unity and cognitive authorship. Nobody has found the center. There is no location where the streams converge and a decision is taken. No room where sensory data arrives, is inspected, and is acted upon. Motor plans are prepared before the sense of deciding arrives. Valuation, memory, and threat detection run simultaneously, on different timescales, and frequently disagree. The search has been thorough. It came back empty. What exists instead are competing processes and something that narrates the winner. That narrating function is the load-bearing part of the theory. It takes behavior the system has already produced, a choice, a movement, a feeling, and constructs a reason for it. It has no privileged access to the actual causes. It has the outcome, plus a general theory of why people do things. It fills the gap, which is exactly what the split-brain patient demonstrated. The speaking hemisphere knew nothing about the snow scene. It had a left hand holding a shovel and an obligation to make sense. So it made sense, fluently, plausibly, and falsely. The crucial claim is that this is not damage. The surgery revealed the mechanism. It did not create it. In an intact brain, the interpreter has more information, so its stories run closer to the truth. But it is doing the same job, after the fact, in every one of us. On this picture, the unity you experience is real, in the way the output of a committee is real. It is not the report of a chairman. It is the minutes, written afterwards, by a member who was not in the room for most of the discussion. The supporting evidence does not depend on rare surgery. Consider a study in which participants were shown 2 photographs of faces and asked which they found more attractive. The chosen photograph was handed back, and they were asked to explain the choice. On some trials, the experimenters, by sleight of hand, handed over the face that had not been chosen. Most manipulated trials went undetected. Participants then explained, in detail and with confidence, why they preferred a face they had just rejected. Some cited features only the rejected photograph had. That is not a trick played on unusually gullible people. It is the interpreter doing its job on an outcome it did not produce. Confabulation of the same shape appears clinically. Patients with certain right hemisphere strokes deny that their paralyzed limb is impaired. Asked why they will not move it, they produce sincere reasons on demand. And in alien hand phenomena, following damage to the corpus callosum or medial frontal regions, one hand performs organized, goal-directed actions. The person watches with alarm and disowns them. The action has a controller. It is not the controller who is speaking. One thing must be kept separate. None of this is dissociative identity disorder, a psychiatric condition with its own literature and its own controversies, unrelated to the architecture described here. The claim is about the ordinary brain, not about illness. The pattern is hard to escape. The decider arrives after the decision. and the system reporting on it is reliable only when nobody has arranged for it not to be. Suppose the division were performed on you. Your hemispheres are separated. You wake, speak normally, recognize everyone, and go home. By every ordinary measure, you are one person and you are fine. But in the right conditions, half of you can see something the speaking half cannot, act on it competently, and be contradicted by your own mouth. How many of you are in that room? The honest answer is that nobody knows how to count. There is no agreed procedure for determining how many subjects of experience a nervous system contains. No test, no threshold, no unit. We can measure what a hemisphere knows and what it can do. We have no method for establishing whether there is something it is like to be it. That is the deepest thing this chapter has to offer, and it is a gap rather than a finding. The question has never had an experimental answer, in a split brain or an intact one. We have simply been assuming the number was 1. The inference at the heart of this chapter does not go through, and the objection is clean. Every complex system has parts. The parts do different jobs on different timescales, sometimes at cross purposes. That describes any organism, any organization, any engine. It does not establish that there are several subjects of experience present. The brain is not unified as a processor. That does not make it disunified as an experiencer. The evidence has also moved. A 2017 study tested 2 patients with complete surgical division of the corpus callosum. It found something the textbook account does not predict. Across a range of tasks, they responded accurately to stimuli anywhere in the visual field, regardless of which hand answered. Perception stayed divided. They could not compare a stimulus in one field with one in the other. The responding agent did not appear to be split in 2. The author's conclusion? Divided perception, undivided consciousness. That is, 2 patients, and specialists continue to argue about how it squares with 60 years of prior findings. It is not a refutation. It is a warning that the most famous evidence for multiple selves may not show what it has been taken to show. Defenders can retreat gracefully, and the retreat is instructive. The claim, they say, was never that there are 2 people in a divided skull. It was that unity is achieved rather than given, assembled continuously, and capable of coming apart under the right conditions. Grant that, and something has quietly happened. The chapter set out to multiply the number of selves. It has ended up questioning whether the number was ever well defined. Authorship built after the fact means some habits need revising. Your explanations of your own behavior are not observations. They are hypotheses. They come from a system that did not witness the causes and cannot tell the difference between remembering a reason and inventing one. This is not a license for cynicism about other people. It applies first and most strongly to you. Self-control is not a commander overruling impulses. It is an arrangement between competing systems, which is why willpower behaves so little like a decision and so much like a negotiation. And responsibility has to attach to something other than an inner executive, since there is no strong evidence one exists. It can still attach to the whole person, who is the thing that acts, learns, and can be held to account. But the picture of a small deciding self receiving reports and issuing orders does not survive. Notice, though, what the argument kept assuming. Every attempt to divide the self into 2 or 5 or many keeps one idea intact, that a self is the kind of thing there can be a number of, and therefore that somewhere in the system there is at least one genuine owner of experience. The last view refuses that premise. It says there are thoughts without a thinker, decisions without a decider, and a life going on with nobody behind it to whom it is happening. In 1739, a young Scottish philosopher tried an experiment you can run right now. He went looking for himself, not for his body, his name, or his opinions, for the thing that has them. the observer, whoever is currently aware. What he found every time was a perception. Warmth, light, a sound, a thought, an ache. Never the perceiver. He could catch the contents of experience without difficulty. He could not once catch whoever was catching them. For the next 10 seconds, try it. Turn attention around. Look for the one who is looking. Something does happen. Check carefully what it is. Another experience arrives. A feeling of effort. A sense of being somewhere behind the eyes. An image of a location. Another perception. Hume concluded that he was, as far as he could establish, a bundle and nothing else. There may be experiences without an experiencer. Not you are unimportant, or you are fictional, or nothing is real. The claim is narrower and considerably stranger. There are perceptions, memories, decisions, self-models, and a body. There may be no additional entity that owns them, nothing standing behind them, nothing persisting through them as their subject. The center everything appeared to be organized around may be a feature of the organizing, and nothing further. This is a claim about existence, not about layers. The label covers at least 4 positions. They agree on very little beyond a negative. Collapsing them into one is the commonest error made about all of them. Bundle theory, from Hume, is a claim about composition. A person is a collection of perceptions held together by resemblance and causation, with no substrate underneath. The perceptions are entirely real. The rope simply has no core. Anatta, in Buddhist thought, is older and far more precise than its popular rendering. What is denied is a permanent, independent, unchanging essence. What is not denied is the person. Classical analyses break the individual into constituents: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness. None of them is a self of that kind. No combination of them is either. Most schools remain reductionist rather than eliminativist. The conventional person exists, acts, suffers, and bears responsibility. Concluding from anatta that there is nobody there is a category error. The doctrine is not that you do not exist. It is that what you are is a process rather than a thing. Self-model theory is a scientific claim with an ontological edge. There are self-models. There is no self. The model is transparent. That is why nobody experiences themselves as running one. The appearance of an owner is a property of the model, not something the model discovered. Illusionism is narrower still. It concerns properties. What is illusory is not that experience occurs. It is that experience has certain features we are convinced it has. An intrinsic private feel. A subject to whom it is presented. On this view, introspection is systematically wrong about its own object. Those 4 disagree about whether persons exist, whether experience has intrinsic qualities, and whether the whole enterprise belongs to metaphysics or to neuroscience. They converge on one point only. There is no owner behind the process. The strongest case is the one this film has been assembling for 9 chapters without saying so. Every property that seemed to belong to a central self has turned out to be separable from the others. Ownership of the body comes apart in depersonalization and can be redirected onto a rubber hand in 90 seconds. Self-location comes apart in laboratory illusions and under electrical stimulation. Agency comes apart in disorders where actions occur without any felt authorship at all. Autobiographical continuity comes apart in dense amnesia, where a person persists without access to their own past. Unity of authorship comes apart under the surgeon's knife. Social identity is granted from outside and can be revoked. Take a thing apart into components. Find that each component has its own mechanism, its own failure mode, its own neural dependency. Eventually, the question arrives. Is there anything left over that the components were components of? There is also a body of first-person report, which needs handling with care. People undergoing certain contemplative practices describe a state in which the boundary between self and world dissolves, while experience continues, sometimes vividly. So do people given serotonergic psychedelics under research conditions. Instruments have been developed to measure this, and the reports are consistent enough to be quantified. What they establish is limited but real. The sense of being a bounded self is not a necessary condition of experience. These are self-reports, shaped by expectation and setting, and they cannot settle a metaphysical question. They do rule out the assumption that the sense of self is inseparable from awareness. Now subtract them one at a time and watch what happens. Take away the felt boundary of your body. People report this and continue to experience. Take away autobiographical memory. Dense amnesia leaves someone who still greets his wife with joy. Take away inner narration. Meditators describe long periods without it, and stroke can remove it involuntarily. Take away your name and every person who could confirm it. Something is lost. Someone is left. Take away the sense of being the author of your own actions. That happens in several conditions, and the actions continue to be performed. Now, look at the remainder. Is there a final owner standing behind all of that, something the removals were being done to? Or is there only the expectation that there must be, generated by a system that has represented itself as a center for its entire operating life? Notice what you did when you looked. You produced another experience. 3 words have been waiting since the start of this chapter, and nobody has fully answered them. An illusion to whom? If the self is an illusion, something is being taken in. Illusions require a party who is deceived. Say that experience contains a false appearance of a subject. That requires a subject for the appearance to be false too, and the theory has just abolished the only candidate. The reply is that illusions do not need homunculi. A map can misrepresent a coastline without a small cartographer inside the map being fooled. A system can construct and act on a representation that includes a self-boundary without a further self standing by to be deceived. Nobody has to be behind the eyes for the picture to be wrong. That handles the logic. It leaves the phenomenology exactly where it was. Because experience does not merely contain a representation of a subject, it arrives already structured. From here to this, mine. Calling that structure an illusion does not make it stop. It does not explain who the appearing is appearing to. There is a second objection worth stating plainly, because it is where this view does most of its damage in public. The words are not synonyms. Constructed does not mean fictional. Modeled does not mean illusory. Money is constructed and will still bankrupt you. A border is constructed and will still stop you at an airport. If the self is constructed, it is the kind of real thing that construction produces, not a thing that was never there. Defenders of the strong reading accept this and narrow the claim. What is denied is the permanent independent owner, not the process, not the person, not the suffering. Which is, almost word for word, the Buddhist position from 2,500 years ago. If there is no owner, several things change, and not all of them in the direction people expect. Your death stops being the annihilation of a thing that existed. It becomes the end of a process that never had a proprietor. That is not obviously a consolation. It is a different fear, and it may be a smaller one. Responsibility survives. Its basis shifts. It rests on continuity and on the fact that this organism is the one that acts and can be changed by consequences. Your grief survives untouched. You never loved a metaphysical substrate. You loved a process, a way of laughing, a set of habits, a particular attention. That was always what was there, and its ending is a real loss of a real thing. And the fear that opened this film, of a duplicate who is not you, quietly loses its object. There was no further ingredient to be missing. But notice what has not gone away. Experience is still arriving. It still arrives with a perspective, from somewhere, with a structure, apparently, to someone. Remove the owner, and every one of those features stays exactly where it was. Which means the last question of this film is not whether the self exists. It is what the word was ever pointing at. And what, precisely, has just been taken away. 4 of these arguments were never in the same fight as the others. They were answering one question. What makes tomorrow's person the same individual as today's? The substance self, animalism, brain continuity, and psychological continuity are genuine competitors. They cannot all be right about who wakes up in the transplant room. At most, one of them is, and their disagreement is not a misunderstanding. The rest were doing something else. The minimal embodied self explains how a point of view is generated at all. The predictive self-model explains what that generation is for. Narrative identity explains how decades of change are gathered into one life. The relational self explains where a person's standing and obligations actually live. Those 4 are not rivals. They are floors of one building. The conflict was an artifact of putting the same question to all of them. That leaves the 2 ends of the map. They are not symmetrical. The substance self is a metaphysical position that no evidence has supported and none could refute. The no-self family is a metaphysical position with a great deal of convergent evidence behind it, and one unresolved objection at its center. Then there is the question of what is actually known. There is strong empirical grounding for the claim that ownership, agency, and self-location are computed, dissociable, and manipulable. There is strong grounding for the claim that autobiographical memory is reconstructive rather than archival. There is good and contested support for the view that the experienced self is a control model. There is no experimental method for counting subjects of experience. There is none for detecting one. Whether a self exists, as opposed to how the sense of one is produced, is still philosophy, and the evidence has not moved it. 3 conclusions hold. Construction does not mean unreality. A hurricane is a process rather than a substance, and it will still take the roof off. If the self is something a living system continuously does rather than something it contains, that makes it a process. It does not make it a fiction. Continuity and survival are not the same question, and the confusion between them has been doing enormous work in the background of this film. What you want when you want to survive is that certain things continue. This body, this perspective, these commitments, someone who remembers. All of those hold in degrees, and all of them can hold twice. Identity does neither. When the 2 come apart, it is not obvious that identity is the one worth having. And a thing can be real without being one object. An orchestra is not a fiction and is not a substance. It exists while it is being played, which brings back the room from the beginning. 2 people wake with your memories, your fears, your private certainty. You have been waiting the whole film to be told which one is the original. The map points somewhere harder. There may be no single fact left to find, not because the instrument is missing, because the question assumed one object. The evidence keeps returning processes. That is not a failure of the investigation. It is what the investigation found. The self was never one thing that could be present or absent. It was a living organism, maintaining a point of view, running a model of itself, telling a story about what it had done, held in place by other people. 5 processes given one name, after which we went looking for the thing the name referred to. So the sharper question is not what you are. It is which of those you mean when you say the word, and which one you were actually afraid of losing. If this has given you a more exact version of the question, send it to someone whose answer would be different from yours. Not the person who will agree with you, the one who would have chosen another word. Subscribing keeps you with the investigation. There are more maps coming, and each takes a question this size and refuses to be quick about it. And if you are in a position to help keep this work independent, membership and super thanks are the ways that is done. They are not the price of entering the conversation. They are what makes the next one possible. Tomorrow you will wake already knowing who you are. You now know how much work went into that, and how little of it was done by you.